Today we are going to have a really insightful and intellectually stimulating discussion focusing upon economic diplomacy of Southeast Asian countries amid the Sino-American decoupling. Much has been said and written about the after effects of decoupling for Southeast Asia, as well as about the specificity of decoupling itself. And today we are going to have distinguished speakers from both Russia and other countries, and the key role player is Aladdin Rilla, a senior economic advisor from Economic Research Institute for ASEAN and East Asia. Dr. Rilla served as ASEAN Deputy Secretary General for ASEAN Economic Community. And the second speaker is Aaron Jet Ruben from Asia Pacific Pathways to Progress. This organization is situated in the Philippines. Then we are going to listen to three Russian speakers, Vasily Kashin and Alexander Kadarov from the Higher School of Economics. And the last but not least in significance, this person is one of the most distinguished and respectful Russian researchers, Dr. Viktor Sumsky, a leading expert from ASEAN Center in MGIMO University. And before we continue, let me very briefly outline the schedule of our discussion. First, the speakers will be given the floor for their presentations, and Dr. Rilla is expected to speak for 20 minutes, while other speakers are given 10 minutes each. And I am going to be very strict about the schedule, and I respectfully ask all the participants to stick to the schedule very carefully. And two topics will be raised and discussed. First, decoupling and its implications for Southeast Asia, and second, instruments to respond. Institutional, technological, trade, and other instruments. And the key question, to be more specific, the key question are going to be as follows. Which Southeast Asian countries are expected to be the main losers due to the Sino-American decoupling? And here we have a good opportunity to compare views expressed by the Russian and the foreign speakers, and in my opinion, this is going to be insightful. The second question, which I would ask to elucidate on, relates to the after effect or the Sino-American decoupling for the ASEAN economic community. And finally, which mechanisms, if any, can ASEAN as a multilateral dialogue platform apply to overcome the negative after effects of the Sino-American decoupling upon the ASEAN economic community? These questions are expected to be given insights during their presentations, and then we will start the Q&A session, and finally the moderator will ask each speaker the final question, and the same question will be asked to all the speakers, and then our discussion will be completed. And I am really sorry for not having done it before. Let me very briefly introduce myself. My name is Evgeny Kanaev. I am a professor of the School of International Regional Studies, Higher School of Economics. Here we go. And Dr. Rilla, the floor is yours, and we are going to listen to your presentation.
Okay, thank you so much. I hope you can hear me well. Okay, right? Yeah. Thank you so much, and good afternoon to everyone. It is indeed my pleasure to be here, and I would like to thank the Higher School of Economics for inviting me in this particular expert seminar. My remarks or interventions for today will focus on two issues. One is on the issue of how ASEAN is able to perceive the current US-China rivalry. And second, how ASEAN is able to respond in terms of being able to mitigate the challenges that arise from this rivalry. So I would like now to discuss these issues one by one. I think the first one is on the perception of this issue. For ASEAN, the US-China rivalry or decoupling is an important issue for the region, for the simple reason that this has significant implications on the economies of different ASEAN countries. And already we're seeing of this economic decoupling in the region, as evident, for example, in terms of the escalation of the trade tensions and the technological fragmentation between US and China. And more recently, the unwinding of the global value chains that link the American firms and the Chinese manufacturers in the aftermath of the COVID-19 pandemic. When we look at the issue of decoupling or economic decoupling, I think we all agree that any economic decoupling in a highly integrated world is always destabilizing, for the simple reason that it undermines the economic growth assumptions over the last 40 years, and also it creates some sources of uncertainty and risk among countries in the world. In the case of the region, okay, I think there was an assessment by the IMF that suggests that technological fragmentation between US and China would lead to losses amounting to 5% of GDP for the world economy, or about or similar or 10 times more than the expected cost of the trade wars imposed or trade tariffs imposed by China and the US. Obviously, this will have an impact on economic growth for China and the US in terms of a possible slowdown. In the case of ASEAN, I think it is very obvious that there is no winner from this protracted rivalry between US and China. I think for the simple reason that these two countries are important partners of ASEAN in terms of trade and investment. For example, ASEAN right now is the largest trading partner of ASEAN. China right now is the largest trading partner of ASEAN, and also China is the fourth largest source of foreign direct investments into the region. Similarly, when we look at the US is the second largest trading partner of ASEAN right now, and also the US provides is the third largest in terms of the source for foreign direct investments. The region also is very much connected to these two economies, basically through the participation in global value chains. And I think that would explain why, if there is a growth or slowdown in these two economies, ASEAN countries will definitely be affected in one way or another. I think another cause of conflict or rivalry to ASEAN is the possible weakening of rules-based international trading system. If you look at ASEAN has been very successful over the years in terms of participating in the global value chains. And I think that participation is very much also influenced by the certainty in an open and rules-based international trading system. Unfortunately, if you look at what's happening right now, US and China are still to move forward, even though the one-phase deal was agreed last year. And I think that would suggest that the tensions between these two countries will continue. And as a result of that, will create a lot of uncertainties to different countries, including in ASEAN. So within this context, if you look at this US-China decoupling, I think it is something that we cannot just ignore, right? For the simple reason that it generates a lot of implications. But in my view, the economic decoupling between US and China is still a way to go, okay? Meaning that I don't think it will really be happening to the extent that will impact a lot, okay, to the world. And the way I see it is because there's two important reasons. Why is because if you look at the world economy has become much far more integrated than before, to the extent that any bilateral decoupling, in my view, is unlikely to unsettle the links among countries in the world. Secondly, if you look at the nature of the international trade, the global international trade has changed significantly also over the years. Global trade is very much interwoven into the vast network of multi-country supply chains. Therefore, any diffusion on bilateral trade across this multi-country supply chains will not be able to offset, okay, the possible decoupling from the US and China, okay? That's the way I see it. But nonetheless, considering the importance of this issue, of this decoupling issue, I think there's two important considerations for ASEAN to be able to manage this potential conflict or rivalry. First, I think it is very important for ASEAN to remain proactive and to be able to work with different like-minded countries in ensuring that this conflict will not really create more adverse impacts into the region. I think this is very important so that ASEAN will be able to engage with other partners in the world, okay, should these fractures between China and the US will also worsen. So I think the ability for ASEAN to engage in promoting multilateral arrangement is very crucial here, particularly in terms of supporting any reforms in the global trading system, because that would definitely help ASEAN in terms of being able to benefit from the international trading system. Secondly, I think it's also important for ASEAN to be able to remain on the driver's seat, okay, of the regional strategic mechanisms and initiatives, such as, for example, the East Asian Summit, the ASEAN +3 cooperation program, and the most recent initiative, which is the ASEAN Outlook on the Indo-Pacific. I think this would allow ASEAN to have the opportunity to become the key stakeholder in terms of managing the security and economic architectures in the Asia Pacific. And that will also allow the region to be perceived on its value as a group, because right now I think there is a risk of ASEAN being caught in the middle, okay, of this conflicting interests between China and the US. And I think it is very important for ASEAN to be cognizant of all these realities. This brings me to the second issue that I want to discuss, and this is about how ASEAN is able to respond to mitigate the risk of this protracted rivalry between the US and China. And in here, I would like to emphasize the long-standing commitment of ASEAN to enhance or to ensure there is economic resilience in the region and to ensure long-run competitiveness. And this is made possible through the process of regional economic integration. For example, under the ASEAN Economic Community, or AEC, ASEAN has remained committed to keep the markets open for trade and investment, and also to promote supply chain resilience, particularly during this COVID-19 pandemic crisis. In the region right now, there is a regional action plan to promote supply chain resilience, and that regional plan is currently being implemented across countries in the region. Similarly, if you look at the ASEAN Comprehensive Recovery Framework and the implementation plan, an important strategy of the plan is how the region can enhance supply chain connectivity. And in that plan, we have indicated how the region should be able to put up measures that would address the adverse impacts of the pandemic on critical sectors such as tourism and aviation, for example. In addition to this, ASEAN has been able to explore a number of new initiatives in order to keep confidence on the markets. I think one very good example of this is that during this pandemic crisis, ASEAN has been able to accept electronic documents in trade transactions in the region. I think the idea of that is to be able to mitigate the impact of this COVID-19 pandemic crisis on interregional trade and investment in the region. Last year, also, the economic ministers in ASEAN have signed this memorandum of understanding on essential goods. I think the idea there was to identify a list of essential goods that countries should not be able to impose any restrictions. I think the goal is to make sure that by identifying these essential goods, we are able to enhance the supply chain connectivity across countries in the region. At the same time, the region right now is exploring the possibility of incorporating on the existing FTA agreements in ASEAN provisions on how to enhance resilience in order to make sure that the region will become resilient against future pandemics. I think one important thing to highlight here is the fact that in the process of creating a single integrated market, the goal is to make sure that there is resilience within the region. And that idea of economic resilience, the way it is discussed right now in the region, is actually being addressed by looking at three important priorities in the region at the moment. One important priority is to optimize the potential of interregional trade and investment, and to make sure that the region is able to develop a more strategic approach to regional economic integration. I think the goal there is to make sure that ASEAN is able to embrace the post-pandemic global restructuring after this pandemic. And that is by ensuring that there are competitive conditions in the region that will make ASEAN as an important investment destination, as well as an important trade hub or market hub in ASEAN. We're also looking at how we can enhance connectivity in the region, as well as how to promote regulatory reforms as part of optimizing intra-regional trade and investment. Second, ASEAN right now, if you're following the region, there's a lot of efforts right now on accelerating digitalization or digital transformation. If you look at the region, I think during this pandemic, there is a strong evidence that suggests that digital technologies have played a very important role in enhancing the productivity on the way people interact with each other and businesses operate. That's why, in my view, the opportunities being provided by digital technologies need to be captured as well in a post-pandemic recovery. So in that regard, the region is now in the process of developing a consolidated strategy on the fourth industrial revolution that would set the direction for ASEAN in terms of embracing this 4IR. There are also existing initiatives to promote digitalization in, for example, e-commerce, in terms of how we can strengthen digital infrastructure, how to promote greater data governance in the region, and how to strengthen cybersecurity. I think all of these initiatives are crucial if ASEAN is to accelerate digital transformation in the region. Finally, I think there's also this issue of ASEAN trying to make sure that we are able to address sustainability across different dimensions. Sustainability is an important priority right now in ASEAN. And the way it's done is that we're trying to set the priorities on how sustainability can be achieved. Right now, there's two important priorities in terms of facilitating the low carbon transition in the region, as well as in promoting sustainable investment and financing. Currently, this year, ASEAN is developing the very first regional framework on the circular economy. I think this is a very important initiative for the region because it would allow the region to be able to address sustainability across different dimensions, including, of course, the circularity of the supply chains. Finally, let me talk about the last topic, which is RCEP. Okay, I think RCEP is the most important achievement in the region last year. As a ASEAN-led process, RCEP, in my view, signifies the commitment of ASEAN for a rules-based international trading system that would support regional economic integration in the region and at the same time enhance our economic relationships with the rest of the world. This is an important agreement because of its possible impact. Again, if RCEP is fully realized, it would account for around 30% of the world's population, output, as well as trade, and also around 20% of total foreign direct investments across the globe. If you look at RCEP, in addition to specific provisions on goods, services, and investments, RCEP is able to include specific disciplines on e-commerce. I think that's the beauty of this agreement. There are specific disciplines on e-commerce, intellectual property rights, competition, as well as government procurement. And these are issues that are yet to be fully discussed in the region. The fact that RCEP is there and the fact that RCEP is able to include these new disciplines, I think is a very welcome development in the region to be able to discuss these issues in a more holistic manner. In RCEP also, there is a technical and economic chapter that allows for capacity building for less developed members of RCEP to be able to discuss issues across different dimensions. And at the same time, RCEP is trying to be modern and also very responsive to the needs of participating countries in RCEP. I think one very important objective of RCEP is to be able to open up the markets among the 15 participating countries, and also to be able to promote greater employment among businesses and peoples in the region. And this is made possible by specific provisions in RCEP on market access, rules and procedures, as well as development dimensions. Let me discuss these three issues one by one. I think in terms of market access, once RCEP has been entered into force, it would enable the region to eliminate tariffs on 65% of traded goods in the region. Okay. Also, I think that number will increase to 92%. Assuming that the tariff adjustment mechanism is completed. So there will be a significant reduction in tariffs as a result of RCEP. RCEP also contains improvements on market access in terms of services, that it covers around 100 services sectors, okay, that the participating countries should be able to address or to focus on in terms of eliminating discriminatory measures as well as restrictions in these 100 sectors. There are also significant market access improvement in terms of the movement of natural persons. I think that is very important, as well as in terms of how the region is positioning itself as an investment. For example, there are commitments on prohibitions on performance requirements, as well as specific provisions on ratchet effect that are not in the ASEAN +1 FTAs. So I think that makes the RCEP a more comprehensive agreement. But I think the more important value add of RCEP is in terms of the rules and procedures, okay? Because if you look up RCEP, for example, under RCEP, rules of origins requirements have been streamlined and simplified, in a sense that there is only one set of rules and procedures that can be applied across the different exporters in 15 participating countries in order to avail the tariff preferences. Also, if you look at RCEP compared to the ASEAN +1 FTAs, RCEP is more trade facilitative, okay? What do I mean by that? Meaning that under RCEP, for example, if you look at customs procedures, there are more provisions that allow for better trade facilitation in the region. In terms, for example, of advanced rulings, in terms of additional trade facilitations on customs procedures and the rest. Also, if you look at non-tariff measures, within RCEP, there are also more improvements in terms of how we can facilitate or manage non-tariff measures. For example, there is within RCEP a provision for greater consultation, okay, among different players to ensure that RCEP will be able to impact favorably on the markets. So in summary, I think if you look at RCEP, in my view, is very important because it comes at the most opportune time where the need to enhance supply chain connectivity is crucial, particularly during this COVID-19 pandemic. And at the same time, I think it boosts market confidence, market integration in the region for the simple reason that RCEP very much signifies the ability of the region to engage in a rules-based and open multilateral trading system. But for me, the success of RCEP depends so much on to what extent it's going to be implemented. Okay, so the ratification RCEP is, I think, the most important priority right now in the region. We need at least 6 countries to be able to ratify the RCEP agreement, at least 4 ASEAN countries and 2 from the RCEP participating countries. And also the way I see it, RCEP being a market-driven initiative, the success of RCEP depends so much also on to what extent the markets are able to participate into the implementation of this agreement. Otherwise, without the support of the markets, I don't think the RCEP agreement is going to make any impact into the region. So I think these are my thoughts on the two questions that the moderator has raised earlier, and I'm looking forward to more questions later on. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Dr. Rila. Thank you so much indeed for your very insightful and comprehensive presentation. And as far as I am informed, you are going to leave our conference in several minutes, right? In this case, let's possibly move apart from our initial schedule, and in case you have any questions, you can ask them to our first speaker. Well, the questions from the audience are welcome. Ekaterina Valerievna, you are welcome.
Thank you very much for this very timely and interesting webinar, and thanks for posing such important questions. If I may ask a question in regards to the RCEP, the speaker mentioned that it is important because of the connectivity issue is now as acute as probably ever. My question is, once the RCEP is in place and it is properly ratified and starts to action, what will happen with other regional FTAs like CTTP and bilateral FTAs, and for example, Asean and Australia and New Zealand have a multilateral FTA already in action for some time. Who will care about the compatibility of the requirements under different frameworks? Thank you.
Okay, can I answer the question? Yeah. I think the existing bilateral FTAs, the ASEAN +1 FTAs, will continue to exist because if you look at the existing bilateral, the ASEAN +1 FTA, there are also specific provisions there that are going to also affect favorably the ASEAN member countries. I think one important example there is in terms of technical cooperation and capacity building. For example, you mentioned about the ASEAN, New Zealand, Australia FTA. I think that for us it's the most successful among the ASEAN +1 FTA because it provides a more comprehensive approach in terms of looking at issues in ASEAN. At the same time, it is able to help the less developed members of ASEAN in terms of building the capacity in understanding some issues with regards to FTA. So to answer your question, the existing ASEAN +1 FTAs are actually complementary to RCEP, okay? So those +1 FTAs will still be there, but I think the beauty of RCEP is that it includes additional disciplines, as I mentioned before, that are not in the ASEAN +1 FTAs, like for example, e-commerce. ASEAN right now is very much keen in accelerating digital transformation. And in our view, digital or e-commerce is the way forward in terms of further deepening market integration in ASEAN. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Rila. Are there any more questions from the audience? Well,
may I ask, Professor?
You have a unique opportunity to ask Professor Rila your questions, since he was responsible for this specific part of ASEAN's activity for 3 years. And Aiselu, you are going to ask your question, right?
Yeah.
Yeah,
I have a little question. Well, as we're talking about the economic development in this region, what we will do about with the polarization of the economic centers in this region? Of course, some countries will be more developed, and how are
I'm really very sorry for having to interrupt you. Could you please repeat your question again, since I cannot make out what you have been saying? Please.
Can you hear me? Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yeah, thank you, Professor, for your wonderful, magnificent speech. And I wanted to know, as I'm an economist, what we will do in this region about the polarization between countries. Some countries are more economically developed, and how it will be solved in the near future.
Well, how to address economic imbalances and infrastructural imbalances between various ASEAN countries?
Yeah.
Yeah, thank you so much, Julia, for the question. I think you're right. ASEAN is a very diverse region. In terms of economic development, there's actually a market difference among members. I think what ASEAN is trying to do is that through the ASEAN Economic Community, the region is trying to reduce the gaps, among members of ASEAN. And the way it's done is through technical cooperation. Within the AEC, for example, the ASEAN Economic Community, there are specific initiatives that specifically address the needs of the less developed members of ASEAN. For example, if you look at the different FTA agreements, usually the less developed members of ASEAN, they follow a different in terms of tariff elimination, for example, because the idea is that we want to give them more time to be able to build the capacity. So there are provisions, for example, in the different ASEAN +1 FTAs that give preferential treatment, to these less developed countries in recognition of the fact that they have their own development challenges to address. And at the same time, in addition to that, there are other initiatives within the AEC. For example, this initiative on the ASEAN, the narrowing of development gap is an important part of the ASEAN Economic Community. And that is where support to the least developed members of ASEAN is being provided. And I think, again, the idea is to make sure that in the process of doing that, we're able to narrow the gaps. So that at the end, of course, we're not saying that there will be equal at the end, but I think there will be a reduction in some of these structural discrepancies. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you very much. And the last question goes from Yulia Rachinsky, and this is the last question.
Yes, thank you so much for this opportunity, and thank you for the informative presentation. So you mentioned 3 important priorities for ASEAN, like sustainability and digital transformation. Do you think that, or do you provide a special role to civil society organizations in these processes? By civil society, I mean trade unions, chambers of commerce, and the other actors. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much, Julia, for the question. Yes, I think if you look at market integration in ASEAN, it's very much inclusive, so to speak, in a sense that our initiatives within AEC are being developed in consultation with different stakeholders in the region, including the civil society. Let me give you one very good example. Let's say the digital transformation. I mentioned earlier that ASEAN is in the process of developing a consolidated strategy on the 4th Industrial Revolution. In the process of developing that strategy, ASEAN has conducted a number of consultation meetings across different sectors. including, of course, the business sector and the civil society, because we recognize that in order for this market integration in ASEAN to become meaningful, we have to make sure that it impacts not only the business sector, but the overall population as a whole. And that's why, as much as possible, for every initiative that ASEAN is trying to implement, there's always a provision for greater engagement with the different stakeholders to make sure that those initiatives will become meaningful once they are implemented. Yeah.
Thank you very much, Dr. Ila. Thank you very much indeed. And we really appreciate your presentation, your wonderful presentation, and your insightful remarks. Let me once again express my heartfelt gratitude to you for your time, first of all, since time is the most precious thing. And in case you have to leave our conference right now, once again, our heartfelt thanks and hope to see you again. Thank you very much indeed.
Yeah, thank you so much and good luck. Bye-bye.
Right, thank you again. Well, friends, now we are going to listen to another distinguished speaker from the Philippines, Aaron Jet Rabena. This specialist presents the Asia-Pacific Pathways to Progress. This is a well-known think tank which is located in the Philippines. And Aaron, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Professor, for the introduction. Firstly, I wish to thank Professor Alexander Korolev of the Higher School of Economics for the kind invitation to take part in this webinar. I'm very honored because I haven't had much chance to engage with Russian scholars. So this is really a welcome opportunity for me. To my distinguished co-panelists, to all the participants, a very good afternoon to you all. Privet, I hope I said that right. So to start off, I think that in talking about decoupling, China-US decoupling, we should look at it in the broader framework of China-US strategic competition or rivalry, which is now manifesting politically. You can see this in Hong Kong, Xinjiang, Taiwan. Economically, mutual tariffs, economic sanctions, tighter screenings in trade and investments. Technologically, competition for 5G and artificial intelligence. Diplomatically, tighter visa restrictions, consulate closures. Socially, the estrangement of people-to-people ties in the educational and academic areas, and constrained media access in both countries. And in terms of defense and security, we can see tensions over the South China Sea. On the first question, the assessment of impact of China-US decoupling on ASEAN countries, I'd say that overall, there have been pros and cons as to the impact of China-US rivalry on ASEAN. As to the former, the pros, we can see that economically, there has been some positive impact in the sense that there is an ongoing trade and investments diversion arising from the China-US trade war. And this has arguably favored ASEAN countries. In fact, many private companies right now are employing a so-called China Plus One strategy. And that is to diversify their supply chain risks due to the China-US trade war and the COVID-19 pandemic. The same is true socioculturally, where there has been a tourism diversion, where Chinese tourists, for example, now prefer to go to ASEAN countries instead of the United States, especially in the wake of the increase in hate crimes in the United States. Another positive impact of the decoupling is that both China and the US have increased their competition for influence over ASEAN by way of their increased engagements. For example, in 2020, ASEAN has overtaken the EU as China's largest trade partner. In fact, all ASEAN countries have China as their largest trade partner. There has also been the upgraded protocol of the China-ASEAN Free Trade Area, or the CAFTA, which only goes to show that China is moving closer towards ASEAN. And of course, if China has the BRI, or the Belt and Road Initiative, the United States has put up its initiatives such as the International Development Finance Corporation and the Blue Dot Network, among others. Both China and the US are also symbolically increasing their defense engagements with ASEAN through military exercises. In addition to these, more countries or middle powers in the likes of Australia, Japan, Taiwan, South Korea, India, and the EU are giving more importance to ASEAN. And this is because they also want to hedge against the China-US decoupling. As to the cons of the impact of the China-US relations on ASEAN, economically, most ASEAN countries impacted by the trade war include Singapore, Thailand, and Malaysia. And this is because of their dependence on the China market for their supply chain. Relatedly, we can also see signs of zero-sum or divisive mentality as the US continues to call for international resistance on the Belt and Road Initiative and discourage ASEAN countries from partnering with Chinese companies like Huawei. Diplomatically, we see competing visions between China's Belt and Road Initiative and Community of Shared Future for Mankind and the United States-led Indo-Pacific strategy. Presently, China-US rivalry seems to be broadening as the US Indo-Pacific strategy has found resonance in the Quad and various European countries like France, Germany, the United Kingdom, and the European Union. This might even further expand as Canada might follow suit. Notably, under the Quad framework, there is a so-called Supply Chain Resiliency Initiative, where Quad countries intend to coordinate their economic policies to lessen dependency on China. To have a better idea of how ASEAN member states respond to the China-US rivalry, I think it is important that ASEAN be classified into Maritime ASEAN and Continental ASEAN, because ASEAN itself is not a monolithic actor. This distinction is important because it will give you an idea of how ASEAN member states demonstrate their behavior vis-a-vis China and the US. For example, specifically, Continental ASEAN, they do not have disputes with China, while Maritime ASEAN, they do. They have disputes with China and they have
Aaron, excuse me, we cannot hear you. Well, regrettably, something has gone wrong. And
for Indonesia and Vietnam, exhibit more signs of hedging or equibalancing. That is to say, excuse me, I have some connection issues. Where did I stop, Professor?
Now everything is all right. You can continue.
Okay. So against this backdrop, it is safe to say that Cambodia, Thailand, Myanmar, Laos are fully engaging or aligning with China, while Malaysia, the Philippines, Brunei, Singapore, and Indonesia and Vietnam exhibit more signs of hedging or equibalancing. That is to say, they engage with China, but also pursue soft balancing by voicing concerns with China in ASEAN-led platforms and engaging with the United States, specifically or especially in the area of defense and security. So I will stop here, and these are my comments for the first question. Thank you very
much. Thank you very much, Aaron. Thank you very much indeed. And colleagues, once again, let me remind you of our schedule. Since Dr. Rilla had to leave our conference, we asked him our questions after his presentation. But now we are going to listen to all the remaining speakers. And then please prepare your questions, and we will ask our questions to our distinguished speakers after they make their presentations. Well, and now let me give the floor to Vasily Kashin. He's a senior researcher from the Higher School of Economics. Vasily Borisovich, you are welcome.
Yes, thank you very much. Thank you for inviting me to discuss the effects of decoupling on the region. First of all, we need to understand, to my opinion, that Sino-US economic, industrial, technological decoupling is inevitable from one side, but also will likely take a very long time on the other. The decoupling itself is result of deep contradictions which exist between the Chinese and the Western economic and industrial strategies. These contradictions cannot be reconciled. Basically, implementation of the current Chinese economic policies would inevitably lead to massive redistribution of wealth and political power in the world. So there is no other option for the United States but to resist. And this resistance is primarily taking place in the technological and economic fields. Still, the key issue is a matter of time. China managed to take its place in the global supply chains, not by accident, but as a result of very long-term and successful policies, which were education of the largest pool of industrial workforce in the world and very clever policy of infrastructure development of specific infrastructure needed for specific industries. And it's well known that different regions of China have a kind of specialization on various industries, from electronics to furniture, everything. And that puts certain limits on the speed of decoupling. When Donald Trump has raised his tariffs, it soon became evident that most of the expenses caused by these tariffs were fell on the American importers and on the American economy in general. That happened because modern industrial capacity, modern industrial facilities cannot be moved anywhere in a short period of time. The longer you have, the more advanced is the industry, the more time you need to move it to another location. That in turn means that for some industries, relocation, moving away from China, would take significantly more than 10 years. And any attempts to speed up the process would just cause tremendous economic harm to all sides, including the Americans themselves. That is why even during Trump's era, US had to sign phase 1 agreement, and it has become recently known that the Americans, the Biden administration, which is very politically hostile to China, restarted trade negotiations on some kind of new agreement which could additionally lower the tariffs. That means that we will have a very long process when US would gradually create climate to move industrial investments outside of China to other locations, and to gradually limit and isolate the Chinese economy. That is inevitable because the Sino-US animosity has very deep structural roots. Now, who will benefit from this? To benefit from this process, a country needs basically to repeat the Chinese industrial policies, which has allowed China in the past to become the key production center in the world. So for example, for ASEAN countries to be successful in this new environment, the key factor would be the ability of the government to conduct very aggressive industrial policies, which would affect the education of the industrial workforce, which has to be well planned, and you need to educate the right people, but mostly it would be blue-collar workers or engineers, not so much of research people, production engineers, and the need to construct specialized infrastructure for specific kinds of industries in specific areas. In order to conduct these policies and while not being caught in the middle of China-US hostilities, the ASEAN countries will probably need to boost their cooperation in technology innovation with other countries, and we see that there are joint initiatives between ASEAN and South Korea, ASEAN and Japan, and probably that would move to other countries as well, and probably Russia could also offer something in the areas where Russia does have certain capabilities, like cybersecurity, software development, energy machinery, etc. So that will be a very long process, and that will require very sophisticated technological diplomacy. At the same time, this situation is not necessarily bad. We should remember that in the past, similar rivalries, for example, between Soviet Union and the United States, have allowed other countries to get better bargain, to get access to better technology. But to do this, a very strong and coordinated policy will be needed. So much will depend on the ability of individual Southeast Asian countries to implement these policies on the national level and on their ability to coordinate. In the best case scenario, the countries could emerge as winners from this situation, and possibly huge winners in the perspective of probably 15 to 20 years. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Professor Kashin. Thank you very much indeed. And now I invite Alexander Kadarov to join our discussion. He follows closely the key economic, political, and security processes in Southeast Asia, and he has much to say about the subjects that are being under consideration. The floor is yours.
All right, thank you, Professor Kadarov. Yeah, I just got 5 minutes, so I try to squeeze into this schedule. So actually, I have 4 arguments as for the current topic. So definitely, the ASEAN states, the Southeast Asian countries, perceive the U.S. decoupling as a very mixed process. And I have 4 arguments. So first of all, actually, in terms of the official level of the ASEAN member states, they do not appeal to the decoupling discourse. Instead, they actually use the words such as economic coercion or disruption of technological supply value chains and stuff like that, or, for example, trade wars or sanctions wars, but they do not actually appeal to the discourse of decoupling. But definitely, if we actually look at the very official or semi-official statements of the ASEAN member states officials and diplomats, we can see that the ASEAN member states actually perceive the decoupling as, of course, very complex and comprehensive economic coercion measures, right? Which have definitely a very long-term impact on the ASEAN member states, either negatively or positively. And I will also deliver this in my speech. So, secondly, actually, the ASEAN has a very vast experience in terms of the economic survival under very vulnerable and under very toxic political and economic circumstances, right? We can look at the history of ASEAN. We can look at the ASEAN financial crisis in 1997, 1998. Of course, the world crisis in 2008, 2009. Definitely, contemporary COVID-19 is a very negative impact on the economic development of the national economies. But we can say that if we're talking about the US-China decoupling, there's a very new phenomenon for ASEAN. And ASEAN, of course, has to recalibrate its economic diplomacy, its diplomatic resources, its economic resources. Why is a very new phenomenon? Because ASEAN has never experienced this before. ASEAN has never experienced the situation when two major powers, two major economic powerhouses, and especially two strategic partners of ASEAN have so much, hold so much economic pressure towards each other in terms of financial flows, in terms of technologies, in terms of trade and goods, trade and services, and of course, information pressure. So that's why it's a very new phenomenon for ASEAN, and ASEAN, of course, will have to adapt its institutional mechanisms, its diplomatic resources, and of course, try to squeeze its strategic plans as for the development of ASEAN Economic Community, RCP, which was developed today by Professor Rila, and many other digital agenda and many other bilateral and multilateral initiatives. Then, if we're talking about the negative impact of the decoupling, we can back up this with the results of the social polls. For example, one of the most influential think tanks in Singapore, ICS, had recently, quite recently, in February 2021, the social polls on how the ASEAN member states actually perceive the decoupling, and actually very intriguing results of the social polls. So actually 56% of ASEAN member states believe that this US-China decoupling will even more deepen the rift, the internal crisis between the ASEAN member states. So this is very intriguing numbers. Then 53% think that the US-China decoupling will result in the decline of so-called ASEAN centrality, which is already actually in the process of decline, and everybody has actually challenges the ASEAN centrality principles and process, right? So this is actually very, very intriguing and very puzzling for the ASEAN development. How ASEAN can fix itself, fix its institutions, and try to be proactive and try to be central in this process. And this actually, I'm very skeptical about the ASEAN possibility to be central and not to be marginalized amid the US-China decoupling. But at the same time, which is also very intriguing, the ASEAN member states also believe that, especially specific ASEAN member states like Vietnam or Malaysia or Thailand, which are being labeled as one of the major beneficiaries of the US-China decoupling in the foreseeable future. So they believe that one of the possible scenario for the ASEAN member states, it will be the relocation of the supply value chains because of the disruption of value chains because of the US-China trade wars and decoupling in general. So for example, we can look at the different statistics. Just currently, 40% of all ASEAN member states export accounts for the electronics and the machinery and the equipment. So 40% of export is pretty impressive actually in terms of the aggregated number. And just by the 2020, which was of course the year of the COVID-19 and the trade war between the United States and China, we see a huge increase in the export of ASEAN to the United States and to China of actual electronics and appliances. This increase was more than $100 billion. So once again, this is pretty impressive in terms of the numbers. And such, there are several different estimations, expert evaluations. For example, Vietnam is being once again labeled as one of the major beneficiaries of this US-China decoupling. And according to different estimations, 20% for all the supply value chains which were disrupted by the US-China bilateral economic coercion measures. So Vietnam took 20% of these actually, let's say, lost market, which the United States lost, and China, of course, lost due to the technological disruption and financial disruption. So that's why the perceptions, in my final remark for this part, will be that the perceptions are still very mixed. Of course, officially the ASEAN member states and the ASEAN, the General Secretary of ASEAN, they criticize the unilateral policy, the disruption measures, the economic coercion, saying that this just will ruin the liberal economic order and the free trade and fair trade actual regimes in Southeast Asia and Asia Pacific in general. But at the same time, they just have a look and see policy, especially countries like Vietnam, Malaysia, Thailand, which have very good leverages in terms of exporting the electronic, highly valued products with highly value-added products. So they are actually looking for these opportunities to squeeze their own national products and to create the ASEAN regional supply value chains in Southeast Asia. So thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much indeed. And now this is, well, a special moment. It's a great pleasure to invite a person whom I personally consider to be my professional and intellectual mentor. I am speaking about Dr. Sumsky from the ASEAN Center in Gimov University. Viktor Vladimirovich, it's really a privilege and pleasure to invite you to speak. You're welcome. Please switch on your microphone.
Can you hear me?
Mm-hmm.
Thank you very much for this very kind invitation, but even more introduction, but even more for the invitation to listen to the speakers in today's conference. I think each of them, in his own way, had given us a lot of food for thought. So I will react in very general terms, both to the subject of today's webinar and to some of the key issues which were raised. First, economic diplomacy. I have to say I didn't hear much about the role of economic diplomacy in the conditions of decoupling. I think largely because the situation is a little too dramatic and complex to be solved just through polite diplomatic means like talks, negotiations, and bargaining. It probably requires reactions of some other kind due to the seriously disruptive effect of this phenomenon. And I fully support what Aaron introduced in his presentation when he said that decoupling should be seen in a broader strategic context. The possibility of what we now call the US-China decoupling has been, and I think you all know it, the worst nightmare of the ruling and business elites of Southeast Asia for the last 2 decades. The biggest problem now, as I see it, is that they still cannot or don't want to believe that this is actually happening right in front of their own eyes. Why it turns out to be so terribly difficult for Southeast Asians to accept the reality of this process? My answer boils down to the fact that the US-China coupling, if I may use such a clumsy term, was at the heart of what we used to call the Asian miracle, at the very heart. In other words, at the very heart of the unprecedented half-a-century dynamic growth of East Asia, its successful export-oriented modernization, and accompanying flourishing of transnational supply chains, the remarkably smooth and intensive movements of capital, goods, and people, and so on and so forth. To put it in a nutshell, the whole phenomenon of the Asia-Pacific regionalism was very much a consequence of the US-China coupling. The same, I think, largely refers to a still bigger phenomenon, that is globalization, of which Southeast Asian elites always tended to see themselves as major beneficiaries. Acknowledging that decoupling is not something accidental and is going to continue is tantamount to saying goodbye to all that and starting to contemplate an alternative future. Does today's webinar give us an impression that there is a futuristic approach to what is going around the region and the world. You know, to say that ASEAN should be now optimizing potential of regional trade and investment. It should accelerate digitalization, and it pays special attention to sustainability of all the successes it has achieved. I think is like more or less talking about, you know, it's like a prescription to do more of the same. While the situation, I think, calls to something more serious. Anyway, it should not be very surprising that in the midst of decoupling, not a few regional analysts, including prominent ones, insist that it can never be full and complete. And if it's only partial, then it may eventually prove to be reversible. But here I would rather support what Vasily said. Remember, he acknowledged that decoupling, as far as technological cooperation between the United States and China is concerned, will be a gradual process. But he also emphasized that it will continue and it will go, because the depth of the strategic divide between United States and China is very, very big. Forgive me if I'm wrong, but I suspect that some of the perceptions that we may eventually, I mean the region and those who watch it from the outside, well, found ourselves more or less where we were when the pandemic started. This anticipation and attitudes are reflected in the second set of issues on today's agenda. Remember, we were invited to discuss what are the specific institutional, technological, or trade and economic policies that may be pursued by Southeast Asian nations in order to neutralize the destabilizing effects of decoupling. If I understand it correctly, these economic diplomacy measures are basically viewed as may be capable of sustaining the familiar and tested modernization model. But is sustaining it a realistic objective, assuming that economic decoupling is just an aspect of a bigger geostrategic divide between the United States and China? From where I look at it, I conclude that during the Trump presidency, the two powers have gone beyond the point of no return to the kind of relation they enjoyed just a while ago. Strategic trust between them is not to be restored anytime soon. Therefore, the earlier Southeast Asians come to terms with the fact that the US-China combination is there no more to sustain the continuation of the Asian miracle, the better for them, and the more the chances for continuing the process of economic modernization in some other shape. So I basically want to say that while certain partial measures which will help go through the most painful aspects of today's transition are certainly needed, there will be not enough to put Southeast Asia back on track of sustained growth, and a lot of creativity and resilience will be needed to accomplish this this new phase of the Asian miracle. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Viktor Vladimirovich. Thank you very much indeed. And now let's open our Q&A session. And let me use my privilege of the moderator of our session to ask my questions. And I have 3 questions, and they go to each of the speakers. Well, in case one of them responds, this will be enough. Well, with the specific relevance to regional resilience, what really makes me surprised is one of the pillars outlined in the ASEAN economic community to 2015. You remember that ASEAN pledged to establish and said that it had been established a single market and a single production base. I can understand what a single market stands for, but I cannot understand what a single production base means, since ASEAN doesn't produce an ASEAN smartphone or an ASEAN automobile. As far as I'm informed, these plans existed in the 70s and in the 80s, but they didn't materialize. And possibly this is just a prospective measure to invite multinationals, for example, and then establish in Southeast Asia a single production base using the external possibilities. But even in this case, this is highly problematic, since those of you who are informed about the Eurasian Economic Union policy know that to establish the so-called, excuse me for having to say it this way, the Union Tractor, or in Russian, Союзный трактор, between Russia, the Belarus, and the Kyrgyz Republic has been very problematic, since this is a prohibitively costly undertaking. And what exactly is meant by a single production base, and isn't it a fundamental flaw that undermines the ASEAN economic community and its prospects? My second question has to do with the following thing. Of course, it goes without saying that such a large-scale undertaking as the ASEAN economic community means that commercial disputes between companies and states, between various economic and commercial agents will be in overabundance. And the question is like this: why did ASEAN not establish an ASEAN International Commercial Arbitration Center? This question is especially timely, since in Southeast Asia there is, well, a benchmark arbitration center, Singapore International Arbitration Center, and this respectful organization is considered to be one of the best in the world in terms of its reputation and practical results. And why was this experience not translated into the overall ASEAN area? In practical terms, ASEAN didn't move from the decisions adopted during the Vientiane summit in 2004 about establishing a dispute settlement mechanism, but a fully fledged arbitration center is needed. And the final question is like this. Well, Dr. Rila spoke about digital connectivity as an instrument to enhance ASEAN's competitiveness. But let's not forget that China is implementing its own project, part of the Belt and Road Initiative, the Digital Silk Road in Southeast Asia. And let's be realistic about a very simple thing. Your digital possibilities are a function of your infrastructure objects. Suppose China builds an infrastructure object in, for example, Lagos, and it goes without saying that there are Chinese computers equipped by the Chinese soft in the cabinet of, for example, the director, the deputy director, the chief economist, the chief specialist in logistics, the chief specialist in cybersecurity, or informational security, etc. I am driving at a very simple thing, that digital possibilities and infrastructure objects are very closely connected, and part of the digital Silk Road goes to making, for example, in Southeast Asia, or making Southeast Asia an area of Chinese privileged interests from the digital point of view. And as far as I am informed, Chinese companies have already raised the following question. Okay, we cannot wait for all the legal aspects to be resolved. For example, the United Nations Convention on the Use of Electronic Communications in International Contracts, adopted in 2005, hasn't yet entered into force. And let's proceed from the grassroots experience. For example, in case the company Alibaba has the practical experience in resolving commercial disputes, let's institutionalize this experience by adopting and developing and institutionalizing, for example, the Alibaba law, the Tencent law, and the law of other Chinese online trade platforms, since we cannot wait till these great professors in international law do their job well. We should resolve our commercial problems and resolve our commercial disputes in the here and now format. And my question is very simple. In case ASEAN has neither the digital infrastructure, cables and such like things, nor soft equipment, for example, well, your computers should be equipped by Chinese software, nor digital competences. Can we really speak about, can we seriously speak about ASEAN's resilience as far as the digital side of things is concerned? And I agree with Vasily Kashin, since cybersecurity is a hot topic in the present day Southeast Asian geopolitics. But does ASEAN have practical resources and practical competences to efficiently respond to this very important and very serious challenge? And let's start from these three questions. First, about a single production base in Southeast Asia. What is it? Second, about the international commercial arbitration in Southeast Asia, why ASEAN has been unable to do it. And third, about ASEAN's lack of resources to make a sustainable development of its digital possibilities from both the commercial and the security perspective.
Yeah, I can start if you want by your questions. And actually, all the three questions are intertwined to each other. So we can say that, yeah, the single production base is non-existent feature in Southeast Asia, and despite all these plans, these fabulous master plans on the connectivity and stuff like that, I think it's not possible to create the single production base, because actually the single production base is very close to what exists currently in the European Union, right? The single market, or in the Eurasian Economic Union, the single market. But so the four freedoms, right? But of course, there are no four freedoms in ASEAN. There are no supranational bodies which will be responsible for the development, for the implementation of these initiatives. Another issue is, of course, the unhealthy competition between the states, because actually we can even look at the statistics, because the intra-regional trade in ASEAN is just 22.5%, and intra-regional FDI is just 14%. It's actually nothing, right? If we're talking about the long-term, non-existent regional association like ASEAN, right? So and the other problem is actually the lack of institutions which will be responsible for the dispute settlement mechanism, as you mentioned. So we know there is a WE&IA protocol, right? But it's also just very vague and dysfunctional body, let's say. But at the same time, that's why I just don't think that the ASEAN will move towards the creation of some kind of commercial arbitration centers, because they just don't like they don't want to impose a new kind of bureaucratic regimes which can just be the overlapping with the existing regimes, right? Which is the dispute settlement body. But at the same time, all the major, let's say, issues between the states, the ASEAN, were actually dealt in the dispute settlement body in WTO, right? For example, the dispute between Singapore and Malaysia, the dispute between the Philippines and Thailand on the semiconductors. So I do believe that given the contemporary crisis of the dispute settlement body in the WTO, so just ASEAN really needs to develop its own, or at least not to develop, but at least to create, or at least to fix, to handle the existing dispute settlement regimes, which is still WE&IA protocol. But I still believe that it will be more on consensus based. It will be it will not be the legal binding mechanism, which is very sensitive for the security, for the domestic resilience and the regime resilience in the ASEAN states. Yeah, I think, yeah, and as for the last question, yeah, so of course they have, once again, they have so many digital master plans and digital master plan 2025. But answering your question, I think no, they don't have enough competences to do that. They don't have enough political will also as well to develop its own digital infrastructure. They don't have enough money, especially after the COVID-19 is such a bizarre in terms of economic development of the ASEAN member states. So that's why, of course, they will just use the economic resources for the different means, for the tourism sector, for the services, right? So that's why the digital sector will, of course, will be in a very vulnerable position. And the other thing, of course, they're still very dependent on Chinese market, especially some countries like Cambodia, Laos, Myanmar, Brunei, which of course the gap in terms of the economic development, in terms of digital development between, for example, Singapore and Cambodia, right, is actually is increasing currently, is very harsh. So that's why I don't think that due to these different reasons which I brought, the ASEAN will develop a single production-based commercial arbitration center, and as well the real implementation of digital resources, which can be the alternative towards the US-China decoupling. So I don't think that. I think that it will be more dependent on not only Chinese market, but also on the South Korean market, Japanese market, even in India, which is also increasing its digital presence in Indo-Pacific and Asia-Pacific as well.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much. And this is really a good job, since you covered all the aspects that I mentioned. Vasily Borisovich, do you have any remarks?
Well, concerning the digital resilience, first of all, of course, ASEAN is in disadvantageous position. Still, I think it would be an exaggeration to say that they have nothing like to rely on. First of all, certain ASEAN countries do have certain capabilities and achievements in fields like cybersecurity, cyber warfare, cyber intelligence. These are these are Vietnam and most likely Singapore. So they do have something. Second, they could use the current situation to better negotiate with the rivaling superpowers to achieve at least certain degree of localization of production of some types of equipment. They could try to combine software and equipment from different suppliers, including not just China and United States, but countries like Russia, India, Israel, and with clever policy, countries which, even the countries which are lacking production capabilities and lacking their own strong ICT industries, they could achieve certain degree of resilience and safety. At the same time, of course, the biggest challenge is implementing some kind of ASEAN-wide industrial initiatives. I don't think it's feasible in most cases because, well, we know that even within the European Union framework, where all of the integration institutions are much more developed, such initiatives, even in narrow sectors such as defense and space, have been progressing with certain difficulty. So more likely certain ASEAN countries could cooperate with each other and implement certain programs, but alliance-wide cooperation, taking into account their political differences, their different strategies relative to China and the United States, I think it will be difficult.
Thank you very much. Are there any more remarks to respond to my questions? Aaron, would you please do it?
Yeah. Thank you again, Professor. I think I'd agree with Professor Alexander about the issue about dispute settlement mechanism. ASEAN is still not as institutionalized as the European Union is. So I think most ASEAN countries still prefer to, settle disputes on a bilateral basis as far as dispute settlement mechanisms are concerned. And as to the issue of cybersecurity and digital connectivity, there are varying receptions amongst ASEAN countries. I give the example of my country. Even if we are the closest partner of the United States in ASEAN, the Duterte government has allowed the reception of the Chinese telecom to become a third telco player in the Philippines. And we have also allowed a Chinese surveillance technology to operate in the Philippines. And I think this is because the Philippines is not an advanced, it's not a developed economy. And so what matters really for us, I guess, is the issue of practicality. These are the things that we need right now before we think of issues like security. So I guess that's a difference between the alliance management perceptions between the Philippines and the United States. So I think developing countries tend to value practicality more, vis-a-vis more advanced countries or economies. And however, this is not absolute because by contrast, Vietnam has not been very receptive to Chinese 5G technology. They have been receptive to trading with China to receiving Chinese investments, but as to when it comes to advanced industries, each ASEAN country still has different levels of perception and reception towards let's say Chinese overtures. So these are my comments, and I'll be mentioning these partly later on in my remarks for the second question. So thank you.
Thank you, Aaron. Thank you very much indeed. Well, I see that I see Lugarayeva wanted to ask her question. I see, can I ask you to switch on your microphone and ask your question aloud?
Yeah, thank you, Professor. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you.
Well, I wanted to...
Sorry, your question goes to Alexander Kadarov, right?
Yeah, I think for Professor Kadarov, but if other professors want to clarify this point, I will be very happy. Well, as Professor Kadarov mentioned, Vietnam has a number of opportunities, technological ones, in collaboration with the Republic of Korea. But how are they used it? Does Vietnam creating or promote their domestic digital projects, or it just becoming just a production output for South Korea?
Yeah, thank you, Arsul, for your question. I can say that both actually, so both which you mentioned is the case for Vietnam. So actually Vietnam currently is the outpost for the supply value chains, which went to Vietnam after the disruption of supply chains amid the US-China decoupling. But at the same time, Vietnam is producing its own semiconductors and wireless communication equipment and exporting it in the not just in the countries like South Korea or India, and it's even one of the case that one of the major one of the most increasing export structure of Vietnamese export to Eurasian Economic Union is actually also the semiconductors and the electronic equipment, such as different printers and radio and stuff like that. The same goes not only to Vietnam, also with, for example, Singapore and Malaysia, which is also one of the largest semiconductors and electronic schemes for the mobile phones or for different cell phones and stuff like that. So it's also exporting via the ASEAN member states, but majorly to external countries, because once again, because of the lack of the supply chains in Southeast Asia, and unhealthy competition, because Vietnam and Singapore, the Philippines, Thailand, they're actually exporting electronic resources, so that's why there is a lack of joint cooperation projects between these countries. So they're basically their policy, economic diplomacy, is aimed not on the Southeast Asian market, but the external markets like European Union, the United States, China, Australia, New Zealand, and actually majorly it's ASEAN dialogue partners within the RCEP.
Well, are there any more questions? Please do not hesitate to ask your questions to our speakers. Well, who else wants to? Anton Bugayenko, please switch on your microphone and ask your question aloud. And specify who the question goes to.
Hello, can you hear me? Oh, yes. I'm Anton Bugayenko, an sinologist from Kazakhstan. So my question is related to my region, Central Asia, and the Chinese movement in Southeast Asia. I mean, SREP and this new Chinese strategy in the Southeast Asia region. What do you think about the perspective to about if China will unify the Central Asia and Southeast Asia regions? As I saw in China, as I heard from Chinese officials, they trying to do this. They trying to ask Central Asian states to make a more economic, especially economic cooperation with Southeast Asia. So from this perspective, I've realized, is it possible that China will be in a breach between Central Asia, or maybe we can say more, a Eurasian Economic Union plus Central Asia, with Southeast Asian countries and maybe East Asian countries too, because SREP including South Korea and Japan. Thank you.
Well, I suppose that this question is a little bit far-fetched from the focus of our today's discussion, since we are discussing the situation in Southeast Asia, and I want to be specific about this very important point. We are discussing how Southeast Asia reacts to the after effects of decoupling, Sino-American decoupling. But since this question has been asked, it should be given a good answer, and I suppose that Vasily Borisovich is possibly the best person to address this question.
Well, thank you very much. I think, of course, like in general, Chinese would be interested in Eurasian Economic Union, including Central Asian countries, using China as a mediator or a kind of bridge in their relations with Southeast Asia. However, I don't think it's an important dimension for the Chinese policy, simply because that the ties of Eurasian Economic Union countries, except from Russia, with Southeast Asia are quite limited. They have limited opportunities to export their commodities to Southeast Asia because of the geography. Besides, I don't think these two strategies are in Southeast Asia and Central Asia are closely connected. What we could see is China a kind of growing, becoming more passive in Central Asia. We know that, for example, over the last 10 years, Chinese trade with Kazakhstan, which is the biggest Central Asian economy, has decreased considerably. Chinese share in FDI inflow into Kazakhstan has dropped by almost 50%. So Central Asia becomes a kind of important but secondary dimension of Chinese policy, where they pursue their agenda to significant extent related to security and energy and logistics, but their ambitions are probably more limited than in the western part of Pacific. I think they just they do have their own cooperation mechanism with the region. They have their own C+1. They would develop some forms of cooperation, but it's like it's not directly connected to their Southeast Asian strategy.
Thank you very much, Vasily.
Can I also add, Professor?
Sasha, you're welcome.
Yeah, thank you, Anton, for your question. So yeah, I agree with Vasily Kashin that I actually don't think that China can become a bridge, as you mentioned, between the Central Asian and Southeast Asian due to different reasons. So actually, yeah, for example, Eurasian Economic Union and ASEAN have the, let's say, institutional dialogue. They have the memorandum of understanding, but at the same time, basically the Southeast Asian countries perceive the Eurasian Economic Union as not like as Eurasian Economic Union, basically, but as Russia plus, right? Because the majority of course, the FDI and the majority of the trade between the Eurasian Economic Union and ASEAN, which is $22 billion currently, it's actually more than 90% is Russia's trade with Southeast Asian countries. So another point is the activeness and the position of Southeast Asia, because they definitely, ASEAN is not that interested actually in Central Asian and actual Eurasian Economic Union. Of course, there are some, if you look at the different tracks on the free trade agreements, for example, right, Vietnam and Singapore have free trade agreements with the Eurasian Economic Union. Indonesia, Thailand have already expressed their interest in that. But once again, they are basically interested in Russia's market rather than Southeast Asian market. That's the first thing. And the other thing is, if we look at the contemporary plans in terms of the integration of ASEAN, Central Asia is non-existent actually plan in terms of the development of its integration moves. Because, for example, European Union, Canada, Great Britain. So these are, of course, the major directions of ASEAN, let's say, economic diplomacy, but not Central Asia, which is, let's say, very geographically distant and economically and institutionally, they're not that linked with ASEAN currently.
Thank you. And possibly now it's time we asked our speakers the last question to turn to the the final remarks, focusing upon my question, which I especially prepared to finalize our discussion. And I see that Yana Shemekina is trying to ask her question, right?
Thank you so much. No, it's not my ask, just I think about maybe with you on, we need to work a lot about the rules to the business on the world, because this is the problem of the USA and China.
Well,
we like Russia, maybe can't be like a bridge with USA and China, like to normalize their relationships.
Sorry, could you please make your question more relevant to the focus of our discussion? And also, could you please specify the speaker your question goes to? Once again, we are discussing the after effects of the Sino-American decoupling for Southeast Asia. And with all my respect and credence to Russia, relations between Russia and the United States, as well as to Russia's policy in Southeast Asia, to Russia's policy in Central Asia, China's policy in Central Asia, we should focus upon the key subject under consideration. Could you please reformulate your question and mention a person?
No, I don't have the question. Thank you so much.
Okay, well, are there any more questions to ask our distinguished speakers? Well, in this case, I want to ask them to answer my question. And this question I suppose, will be answered in turn. First, this question goes to Aaron, then to Vasily Borisovich, then to Alexander Sergeyevich, and finally to Viktor Vladimirovich. And the question is very simple. Well, decoupling is a new reality for ASEAN, and discouragingly and regrettably, the Sino-American decoupling undermines the key competitive advantage that ASEAN has been enjoying since its inception. ASEAN is famous for two main things. First, neutrality, and second, inclusivity. And this is what is conspicuously missing if the decoupling further goes on. But at the same time, ASEAN has been able to perform impressive and remarkable success stories. Let's not forget that these success stories started from the very fact that ASEAN was established, and it wasn't a simple thing to do. Then ASEAN successfully, made another successful step to declare its Zapfan declaration, and then ASEAN was able to resolve the Cambodian issue, and after the Cold War, ASEAN succeeded in establishing the Pan-Asia-Pacific multilateral dialogue platforms. These success stories have been political rather than economic, but the present day realities are different since they make the association to resolve a very important economic challenge. We have spoken about the specificity of this challenge, the after effects for ASEAN and its impact upon ASEAN's prospective plans. And I can say that for ASEAN, this is a very important and a very challenging task to address. And my question, which goes to all the presenters, is very simple. Which components of ASEAN's experience, if any at all, I mean, if these components really exist, can be used to overcome the present complications, economic complications, which the decoupling generates? Can ASEAN's political experience be relevant to the present-day economic challenges the association is currently encountering? And once again, ASEAN has been able to successfully resolve political tasks, and now it has to grapple with a very serious economic challenge. Can some components of its experience related to the political side of things can be adopted to successfully meet this very serious economic challenge and to eventually successfully resolve it? Well, first Aaron, then Vasily Borisovich, then Alexander Sergeyevich, and finally Viktor Vladimirovich. And please give us your arguments why you think so.
Thank you, Professor. I assume this is now the second round of our discussions. Is that right?
Excuse me?
This is now the second
round. The final part of our
All right.
discussion.
All right. I'll give my remarks for this one. So there are two things that I want to say about this. First would be the ASEAN member states' individual responses. Second would be ASEAN's collective response in managing relations with major powers. On the first, I would subscribe to a report published by EY and the Asia Group, in that what's happening in ASEAN is that there's been an increase in government intervention to boost domestic growth and national competitiveness. There is also greater attention being paid to policy-driven incentives for supply chain reorientation, given the disruptions brought about by China-US trade war and the COVID-19 pandemic. Also, governments across Southeast Asia have recognized the crucial role of fintech, financial technology, in driving innovation and competition in the region. 5G-related industries are another major focus for the ASEAN 5 countries, and these are Malaysia, Indonesia, Philippines, Singapore, and Thailand. As to my second point, theoretically, ASEAN's role in the Asia-Pacific, or what some now say Indo-Pacific, has always been based on the so-called ASEAN centrality. And this means that ASEAN should be the main driver of regional agenda and community building process. And I would say that ASEAN centrality is similar to ASEAN inclusivity and ASEAN neutrality. ASEAN centrality can be seen in ASEAN being able to have major powers agree to its norms embodied in the ASEAN Charter, Treaty of Amity and Cooperation, and the Southeast Asian Nuclear Weapon Free Zone Treaty. Economically, ASEAN was able to lead a regional free trade agreement, which is the RCEP. All this just go to show that ASEAN is capable of building regional norms. Given this, a major feature of ASEAN's inclusivity is its being reactionary. Now, what do I mean by this? For example, ASEAN's reaction greatly depends on how great powers engage it. You know, when the ASEAN +1 mechanism, which started with China, was brought about, this eventually was replicated and then expanded to become ASEAN +3, ASEAN +6, and then ASEAN +8. Similarly, when China initiated an FTA with ASEAN, Japan followed suit and countered by agreeing to a comprehensive economic partnership agreement with ASEAN. Another example is that when ASEAN had maritime exercises with China in 2018, ASEAN also did so with the United States the following year. And in fact, I think one of the reasons why ASEAN issued the ASEAN Outlook on the Indo-Pacific in 2019 is that because they also accommodated China's Belt and Road Initiative, you know, by issuing a joint statement with China, synergizing the BRI with the ASEAN Master Plan on Connectivity. In other words, it's hard for ASEAN to say no to any major power and wants to equibalance and hedge by engaging with and accommodating all major powers, including Russia, which in essence demonstrates ASEAN neutrality. However, it is important to note, and this was mentioned a while ago by, I think, Professor Alex, that in a survey issued by ISIS think tank in Singapore released early this year, you know, it was found that 61.5% of respondents in Southeast Asia favor aligning with the United States over China if the region was forced to pick sides. And it was also found that 76.3% of the respondents picked China as the most influential economic partner. So you can see here the balancing mentality amongst ASEAN stakeholders. Going forward, we can expect a continued race by both China and the United States, or US-led bloc, to increase their influence over ASEAN. However, even if there might be gains arising from this, some risks lie in a potential conflict over the South China Sea or over Taiwan, which in turn would undoubtedly disrupt regional economic commerce and trade. And so before I end my remarks, I think this question needs to be asked: what's in it for Russia? I believe Moscow should deepen its overall engagement with ASEAN so as to be able to hedge not just against the China-US rivalry, but also against China and the European Union, which serve as its largest economic partners. So I will end here, and I look forward to your further questions and comments. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Aaron. Vasily Borisovich.
I think we need to understand that the prospect for the Sino-US rivalry is a very negative one for the next several years. The struggle between the two superpowers will be increasingly intensive, and the scope of instruments which they will employ would become wider every year. It's quite possible now that we will witness a major military confrontation between them around Taiwan. There will be probably growing military tension in South China Sea, and in a situation like this, probably both powers would increasingly use instruments of economic coercion and intervention into internal affairs to influence the positions of the smaller powers. Actually, right now we see China conducting a sanctions campaign against Australia, trying to influence Australian behavior on a number of foreign policy issues. And previously they have conducted such campaigns against other countries. So that actually means that at some point the situation could resemble the darkest moments of the Cold War. And we should use this experience to avoid the mistakes of the past. And what is needed is strong coordination, strong policies on the national level, and deepening of ties with other powers which are not directly present in the region, such as Russia, Europe, and others. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much indeed, Alexander Sergeyevich.
Yeah, thank you. So answering your question, first of all, I can say that it will be very hard for ASEAN to, let's say, import the same, let's say, features which they used in the political sense, right, in the high politics, because we definitely see that if you're, so you mentioned Zopfan, you mentioned the Cold War and the other historical features for the ASEAN development, but this was actually the existential threat, right, for in terms of the ASEAN, in terms of the survival, right? So that's why they were actually doomed to do something to just survive in terms of political regime, in terms of the physical, territorial integrity and stuff like that. So in terms of the U.S.-China decoupling is less, let's say, dangerous, yeah, in these terms, but even more complex and let's say sophisticated issue, which is very hard for ASEAN to be united in this case, especially since, as we discussed today, there is a, let's say, crisis in terms of unity at the domestic rift in ASEAN. But if something can be exported, let's say, can be implemented and used through these political experience, definitely it's kind of neutrality. So definitely not to choose any side, the United States side or Chinese side, definitely to diversify its partnership, definitely expanded the partnership through the ASEAN Free Trade Agreements network, right, and promoting the different partnerships with non-ASEAN dialogue partners like Great Britain, like some other countries of European Union, which are not integrated that deep into the Southeast Asia, and of course the inclusive, let's say, promotion of inclusive platforms and agreements like RCP, and maybe also ASEAN will try to be more proactive under the APEC and trying to. So we actually saw from the 2020 November APEC summit when ASEAN member states were very proactive in terms of criticizing Donald Trump, in terms of promoting the free and fair trade. So I think that ASEAN will try to couple and to use these opportunities, to use these platforms, ASEAN platforms, APEC, to promote this free trade agenda and fair trade agenda in further years, in foreseeable future.
Thank you very much indeed, Viktor Vladimirovich. Please make your remarks. Please switch on your microphone.
Yes, it's working now. Well, this is.
Sorry, I cannot make out what you are saying. Could you please speak louder? I cannot make out.
How is it now? It's okay?
Now it's better.
Okay, says that throughout the last decade, the whole geostrategic horizon of ASEAN was very much centered on the U.S.-China contradictions. It has eclipsed everything else in the observation of ASEAN strategies, and maybe things are developing. It's time for other.
Sorry, Viktor Vladimirovich, you disappeared for several seconds.
Sorry, I don't think I can do anything
you disappeared for several seconds.
Okay. Get over the tendency to concentrate on just the U.S., China, so on and so forth, and try to see the United States and China, of which Russia is also in fields like energy, modern technologies, food production, and partner for ASEAN, and it's time to pay more attention to each other, take a closer look at the opportunities offered by ASEAN too. I have one remark by Vasily Kashin, which seemed to me very appropriate as far as recommendations to ASEAN were concerned. One, to switch to aggressive industrial policy, which has to be closely associated with educational initiatives in order to prepare a qualified workforce, which without cannot go on. Finally, those who said that there is the danger of ASEAN's fragmentation as a result of all sorts of strategic tensions under which it has to operate today. Issues like South China Sea, the Indo-Pacific initiatives, Myanmar, have clearly demonstrated that ASEAN is not a homogeneous and monolithic entity, and this is something that has to be tackled specially. I mean, the preservation of some kind of minimum ASEAN unity, because without it, centrality, regional centrality is impossible to sustain. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Viktor Vladimirovich. And now we have come to a very important point. We should finalize our discussion. And let me say that we have been successfully sticking to the schedule. And I see that now we have 2 minutes left. And let me make my final remarks during these two last minutes. In my opinion, our today's discussion has been a success, since we have done really very good and very useful things. We have analyzed the specificity of the Sino-American decoupling from the ASEAN perspective, what specifically it means for ASEAN and for both its individual states and the ASEAN economic community as a multilateral project. We have reviewed the security and the political and the economic situation in Southeast Asia, once again seen from the ASEAN perspective, what it means for ASEAN and which specific components of ASEAN's policy can be the key success factors. We have identified the after effects both for ASEAN multilateralism and for individual ASEAN member states. And we have been especially lucky to listen to Dr. Aladdin Rilla, since he was responsible for the ASEAN Economic Community from 2018 to March 2021. And most importantly, today we have enriched our knowledge, we have broadened our understanding on the key processes that penetrate Southeast Asia and a wider geopolitical and geo-economic area. I see that now is 2 p.m. sharp, and my final remark is traditional. Thank you very much, and my special thanks go to our distinguished speakers. And I express my heartfelt gratitude to the audience, since these people are really interested in the subjects that we discussed today. And see you again, and good luck.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.